My name is Dan Dorval, and I'm President and CEO of Dorval and Cherney Financial Advisors. I am an independent certified financial planner and author of my book, Financial Success for the Rest of Us, Reality Based Financial Planning for Mainstream America.
Hi, my name is Leah Woodley. I'm an associate financial advisor with Dorval and Cherney Financial Advisors. Our conversations discuss what it means to do quality of life planning in all areas of your life.
Dan, this week you actually met with a nurse and you had a profound impact on her with the advice that was given her and based on how she came into the meeting and how she left the meeting. Why don't you talk about what happened?
Well, in this case, it was a nurse who has been through some pretty traumatic experiences in the last few years. She unfortunately lost one of her children, her son passed away, and she also went through a divorce. And, we don't get into all the details of all of those past histories, but it sounds like it was a very difficult marriage for a lot of years. And so she was coming out of this divorce feeling particularly vulnerable. And that's a pretty common thing for people who have suffered a major life event, especially completely unexpected in her case. So she thought that she had to do a lot of things that simply were not necessary from a financial planning perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, the first thing is she lost a lot of her retirement plans through her divorce. So in her mind, she thought to herself, okay, I have to save and save and save and save and save. So she was maxing out her retirement plan at work, which was eating up a lot of her cash flow. So that was one thing. The second thing was, I think she felt a lot of guilt from the divorce. And so, from her perspective, she needed to provide for everyone else. She's a nurse, she's a mother, so she is a caregiver. She tends to think about others before herself. And so, in her thought process, she wanted to make sure she could do everything she could for her surviving children, which included college. So she was working unbelievable amounts of hours. I mean, I'm talking like she was making a lot of money because she was working way more than full time. And the way she described it was she was basically working herself to death. I mean, she was
Mhm.
killing herself with the amount of hours she was committing to work. Now, in her mind, that's what she needed to do to help her kids through college, and that made her feel better about her overall situation with her life. And then, this idea of moving forward with fear. She was anxious and, had a lot of fear about the future. She's now a single person after being married for a long time, so she has to rely entirely on herself. And a lot of times we'll see people really lose their empowerment when they're in that situation because they just don't have anybody else to bounce off these ideas of quality of life and what am I going to do in the future. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And so, for us to be able to talk her through what she actually wanted to do with her life, that allowed her to develop some clarity and really gain from that perspective.
Wow, that is a very challenging situation to be in. And like you said, being in a vulnerable position really can make things cloudy. It can make things uncertain, and it does really help to be able to get some clarity and a different perspective from someone else. Now, you said she lost a lot of her retirement assets through the divorce. Is there a way to protect your retirement assets when you are going through a divorce?
Well, in a divorce, for the most part, if you've been married for quite a long time, most of your assets are going to be considered marital assets. At least in the state of Minnesota, they're going to be considered marital assets. For the most part, you're going to split everything 50-50. Okay, so I'll just start with that premise. However, which assets you split can actually come into the negotiating process of a divorce. Now, in her case, one of the very best things that happened is she kept her entire pension. And her pension is something that can be, very powerful as far as a retirement resource. And she gave away more of her 401k plan. Now, she didn't know at the time that that was actually a good thing, but for her, what we were able to show her, and this is partly because she's working so hard and she's making so much money, she's getting very large credits on her pension plan. And when we look at her analysis, if she retires in her, low to mid 60s, her pension plus her social security is actually going to replace almost her entire work income. So she's going to make as much retired as she basically makes working. And so keeping that resource, giving away a little bit more on the 401k side, in her case, and for a lot of the nurses that we help, it is one of the very best things that she could do, because in a divorce, when you try to value a pension, a lot of the divorce attorneys, a lot of the people who guide these women through a divorce, they don't know how to value a pension. There is no right or wrong way to like truly value a pension. There's a couple of assumptions that go into it. They usually hire an outside group. And, if you negotiate and say, hey, I'll give you this lump sum of money for my 401k compared to me keeping my pension for the future, a lot of times people will take far less than what the pension is worth in that negotiation. They want the money now rather than waiting into the future to collect that pension. So in her case, that was probably one of the very best things. But for the most part, Leah, unless you've inherited money or something clearly identifiable as being separate from the marriage, before the marriage, something like that, it is very difficult to protect, even if one spouse did do the bulk of the saving.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I do know that you brought that up in other meetings as well, that just how valuable it is to keep the pension and try to fight to keep that pension. So thank you for clarifying that. Now, when it comes to that issue of guilt, is that something that you see that is common among divorcees, or is this something that was kind of unique to her situation?
Yeah, I think it's pretty common for women who have gone through a divorce. To a large extent, people will tend to think of, hey, I failed. I had a marriage, and because it resulted in a divorce, it reflects on me poorly as some sort of a failure. And of course, there's lots of reasons people go through a divorce, but in her case, it was important for us to remind her to, move forward in an empowering way, and really having that cognitive empathy type of approach of saying, okay, we realize what you've gone through, we realize that the way you're thinking about this might be coming more from an emotional perspective, which happens with money all the time regardless of what our life experiences are. But at the same time, trying to get her to kind of get out of her, she's emotionally involved in her life every day, we are not. So trying
Mhm.
to give her an outside perspective without being emotionally attached to everything, and showing her what is possible. And that possibility starts to penetrate into her over time. It's not something like somebody comes into our office, you meet with them for an hour and a half, and they walk away and they go, oh, this guy that I just met with told me I could retire. That's exactly what I'm going to do. In most cases, it's a process of slowly changing a mindset and slowly starting to see what's possible and say, well, maybe I could do something different if I believe that's going to improve my quality of life. And so for her, she had just gone through this trauma, put her head down, and just was working absolutely as hard as she could, probably more to just like if I'm working super hard, I'm not thinking about being alone. I'm not thinking about my future. I'm just getting through the day.
Mhm.
And financial planning, like in her case, was looking forward and saying, hey, there is going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. You are going to be okay. Yes, you lost a lot of money through this, this divorce, but now you have to think in terms of what's going to bring you quality of life in the future. And you don't need to work this hard. You don't need to save this aggressively, in her particular case, at least.
Mhm.
And you are going to be okay. And now, she started to talk towards the end of the meeting about, well, maybe I'll cut back a little bit. Maybe I won't take
Mhm.
on that extra shift every time. Maybe I can start to imagine what life might be like in the future in a good and positive way.
That's awesome that you got her to that point. Um, I know we fiercely advocate for quality of life, and I know when she said she's working herself to death, I know that was a trigger for you. So it was great that you could provide her with that feedback that she did not have to work as much. And like you said, it is a process. Sometimes we are able to provide good news to the clients that we meet with. And like you said, sometimes they're not readily receptive to what we're saying. So it just takes some time for them to fully process and, actually believe what we're telling them. So I think an important thing that this situation highlights is that financial planning goes beyond the numbers. This was a very emotional situation. This was a very life-changing situation for her. So why don't you talk about that the emotional aspect of financial planning and how we do create balance between addressing the emotional needs as well as aligning the numbers with where they need to be.
Yeah, it's a great question because, I once went to a presentation to a room full of advisors, and the speaker at this particular presentation asked, have you ever had a client cry in your meetings? And I was a little bit surprised, frankly, that only a small percentage of the hands went up in the room. Because in
Mhm.
our meetings, I would guess, I mean, it's probably close to 50%. It's not like we keep track of the statistics, but it's probably close to 50% of the people we help will cry at some point in the meeting. And that's because when we're talking about quality of life, for a lot of people, if you've had major life experiences, you probably have suffered some sort of a trauma. You probably have seen unfortunate situations. And to start to talk in terms of what actually matters to me, that can become very emotional throughout that process. But yet,
Mhm.
at the beginning of our meetings, we have to understand what brings you quality of life. We have to understand what that picture is, and then what our job is to try to put the puzzle pieces together as efficiently as we can to create that picture. Well, the picture is what is emotional. The puzzle pieces are things like health insurance or social security or your pension or
Mhm.
investments, whatever. That's our job to put that together. And so the nurses often resonate with this process of how we do planning because it's a lot like being a nurse. Somebody comes in and they're probably suffering through a difficult time in their life. They're in the hospital and maybe they're scared. Maybe they're not sure if they're going to live through this process, or they have to have a surgery and maybe that's going to have a lot of recovery or something like that. And it's that nurse's job to allow them to feel comfortable enough to understand what this process is, and that when they come out the other end, they're going to have improved quality of life. And that's a lot of times these nurses, they see families that are crying, they see families going through, highly emotional situations, and they have to get through that process while guiding that person from an outside perspective but still having empathy for what they're going through. Financial planning is the same type of process.
Yeah.
It's not usually, at least the way we do things, it's not usually about the numbers. We know the numbers, and they have to
Mhm.
have confidence that we know the numbers, but on the back end, they have to trust that the actions we're telling them to do are in alignment with what will bring them quality of life.
Absolutely. So for someone who's watching this, who may be in the process of a life-changing situation like a divorce, what is one nugget that you would like to leave with them?
I think that really this relentless focus on quality of life is particularly important when we're going through difficult times. Usually, what happens is if you have a major challenge in life, a health challenge, a relationship challenge, something that's really causing an issue, it's better to bring yourself back to a very simple perspective on life. You try to simplify your life rather than overcomplicate things. The world can be a very complicated place. It's a very noisy place. And if we can bring ourselves back to, okay, I'm going to take one action today, I'm going to move forward in a positive way. And if you're going through a divorce in particular, get through the divorce as fast as you can. A lot of times we see these things drag on for a year or 2 years or whatever, and there's a lot of bickering and back and forth. And I think, to be honest, attorneys have a vested interest in making these things as confrontational as possible. They get paid more if the divorce
Mhm.
takes longer. And I always say, get through these things as fast as you can, because now you can take a deep breath, you can center yourself, now start thinking about the future rather than just focusing on every day, and you come out the other end in a better place.
I think that's great advice, and I've heard you give it to other nurses as well. So thank you for sharing that with our audience. Well, until next time, have a good one.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you.